To introduce another member of the Notre Dame Law School, Professor Paolo Carozza, who is the director of the Helen Kellogg Institute for International Studies, director of the JSD program in International Human Rights Law, and a concurrent professor in political science. He is an expert in comparative law, human rights, and international law, and his extensive writings in these areas have been published in Europe and Latin America, as well as the United States. From 2006 to 2010, Professor Carozza was a member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and served as its president from 2008 to 2009. At Notre Dame, he is the director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, an interdisciplinary university-wide institute focusing primarily on themes of democracy and human development. In the law school, he has served as the director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights from 2011 through 2013, and he continues to direct the JSD program in international human rights law. He is also a fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Professor Carozza earned both his AB and JD degrees from Harvard and pursued graduate studies at Cambridge University and at Harvard Law School as a Ford Foundation Fellow in Public International Law. After law school, he served as a judicial clerk for the Supreme Court of the Federated States of Micronesia and worked as an associate at the Washington, D.C. law firm Arnold & Porter. Today, Professor Carozza will be speaking on reasoning about human dignity from within the practices of human rights and human development. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carozza.
Great, thank you so much, Jess, and John, and the Institute for Church Life, and the Office on Human Dignity and Life Initiatives. It's such a wonderful conversation to be part of. Special thanks also to Carter for sort of breaking the way through the ice of philosophical and theological discourse for me, since I also will be focusing on a lot more practical concerns. I was a little worried yesterday that it seems sort of orthogonal to the discussion that was going on. Not irrelevant, but it's just a different way of getting at these questions. But now this morning we've established a slightly different platform as well within this sea that we're trying to navigate. So precisely, I'm going to speak here not as a philosopher theologian amid this very distinguished group of them, and because of that, I'm going to focus in particular on the latter two of the three stated aims of this conference. Those were to articulate a multivalent account of human dignity that's persuasive and appealing. And I'm going to add a footnote here. A question that occurred to me as quite relevant yesterday is persuasive and appealing to whom? We're not really asking that question explicitly yet. In my account, as you'll see, I'm, for my own purposes, trying to answer that question as persuasive and appealing in a global context, which is simply as a factual matter radically pluralistic in terms of the basic commitments, orientations, and traditions that are engaged in the discussion. So that goal continues, persuasive and appealing, by considering the places and practices where the recognition of dignity of the human person cannot be so easily dismissed. And we'll see that's very relevant to this discussion about human rights and development. And secondly, to offer a vision of human dignity anchored in the logic of attending to weakness and vulnerability. Again, highly relevant to these two thematic areas. So I'm not going to focus on clarifying the philosophical and theological foundations as such, although indirectly, I think what you'll see is I try to at least offer some methodological reflections that I hope are going to be relevant for how philosophy and theology might proceed in offering a more attractive account of dignity. So I'm going to look at the practices of human rights and development. Human development, you'll see, is in the title. Just for clarity's sake, for those of you who are not in these fields, I should probably be precise about the terminology here. Human development the term is often used in the context of education and psychology. I'm not using it in that context. It's also used in the context of what has more historically, but for reasons that I'll get to, been referred to as economic development or international development. But now the term human development has become more widespread in that context, as we'll see. So in both of these areas, human rights and human development, we find, in fact, the central use and importance given to the idea of dignity. We can see that our capacity to understand and honor dignity is essential to our capacity to attend adequately to the poor, to the oppressed. And the way that we think about and experience and practice dignity does have enormous practical consequences for our efforts to foster human flourishing in these circumstances. Let me start by giving you a brief overview of the place of dignity in human rights law. Again, Carter paved the way for me a little bit, which makes it a little bit easier. There's no denying that, also as we heard yesterday, the pervasive presence of the idea of dignity in the entire corpus of international human rights law, as well as in constitutional law and the practice of constitutional systems and jurisdictions in all parts of the world across all different kinds of legal traditions. So to the extent that there is any unifying foundational principle or idea to human rights law at all in the world, the only plausible candidate is the idea of human dignity. As both Gil mentioned yesterday and Carter now, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so the first global and comprehensive human rights instrument literally in human history. So today it still is, the Magna Carta of the human rights movement, declares that the recognition of inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. It says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everyone is entitled to realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. Similarly, the two major international human rights treaties that immediately followed that, the covenants on political rights and on economic and social rights, so together with the Universal Declaration, they form what's known as the International Bill of Human Rights, state that these rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. And literally, I could spend the rest of the hour here just going through all the instruments that say the same thing. Because literally, from there to the present day, there's virtually no internationally accepted instrument that fails to refer to human dignity as the basis of human rights. From the European Convention on Human Rights and Bioethics to the International Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights and Dignity, it's even in the title here, of persons with disabilities. The same is true of constitutions, as Carter also noted. Fully, more than a quarter of the constitutions of the world today have centrally enshrined the principle of human dignity as one of their fundamental principles, especially those that came after World War II. The problem is that, of course, that to go from such general statements to a more detailed and substantial understanding of what dignity means in the discourse of human rights is not at all a simple task. So I think it's useful in getting there first to start at seeing how dignity is actually used functionally in human rights law. There are at least 4 different ways in which we typically see it being used. Most obviously, in the declarations and instruments I've already mentioned, dignity is used, as I've already said, to indicate a common source, a foundational principle for the rights that then are subsequently specified. So in this sense, it purports to serve, at least implicitly, as a principle of justification and a principle of unification of the corpus of human rights. And for the same way, in the same reason, it serves as the basis for affirming that political societies of the world, no matter where they are and what traditions they come from, are called to recognize and protect certain rights because they derive from some quality of human beings that exists outside of and prior to the authority of the state itself, and to which states and positive law of the state must be accountable. A second way it's used is as providing within legal systems some sort of overarching or integrating principle or value. It's used to mediate between the conflicts and tensions among other specific rights. This is notable in systems in particular like the German constitutional system, which, as we saw, constitutionalizes dignity, but also where there's what's so-called bridging principle within the constitutional order that helps to bring things together. How do they all relate to human dignity, which is a single undifferentiated thing, and therefore we have to reconcile the other more specific expressions of what human beings require. Third, in a lot of cases, tribunals appeal to the idea of dignity to expand rights, to expand the scope of rights, either by finding that dignity requires extending understandings of existing rights to new contexts, or even recognizing entirely new rights because of the requirements, further reflection of the requirements of dignity in specific circumstances. So this includes in different constitutional orders, for example, finding otherwise theretofore unrecognized protection of the right to the family, the right to education, the right of minorities to use their own language, and so forth. And finally, the fourth is that practice leads to a pattern of courts using dignity to justify their reliance on what otherwise would be not formal positive sources of law. That might mean law from other jurisdictions, it might mean broad principles that aren't constitutionalized, but going outside of the formal hierarchy of sources of law. Okay. Now, if you look at and think of all four of those different functions together, there's one thing in particular that they have in common, one overarching feature of all of those uses of dignity. All of them presume, take for granted, that dignity has some kind of status as a principle that exists outside of positive law, prior to it. That it gains its authority from some sort of objective and irreducible source that then legitimates these appeals to it in order to modify law or to hold law accountable to something else that exists outside of it. So dignity only works, in other words, functionally in the way that it is in fact used in human rights law if we take for granted that it is regarded as some sort of transcendent value. I mean, transcendent in a sort of narrow sense of outside of the positive existing law of a particular jurisdiction, and that law then therefore needs to be held accountable to it. Now, of course, dignity can only do that, in fact, if there's a there, so to speak, right? If there is, in fact, some kind of determinable meaning that does transcend and justify and reconcile and call to account any one specific body of law or any one specific constitutional system. Otherwise, if that weren't the case, exactly these kinds of appeals to dignity would be pure fiction, right? Would be rhetorical, as was being suggested in some jurisdictions. It would be a cloak that covers what would otherwise really, in fact, be the arbitrary exercise of some kind of power and will. So the question then arises, okay, is there in fact some kind of determinable meaning here, an objective quid to the concept of human dignity, at least speaking within the context of human rights law? Now, given the time that I have, I necessarily have to be extremely summary. Everything that I'm going to say is backed by a variety of very specific cases and examples and artifacts of law. Thank you. That's very helpful. Which I'm happy to describe later if anybody wants, but up here I'll just be very summary and say, so first, across virtually all jurisdictions, and at a very high level of generality, but one that is not meaningless, I think, is that dignity is used consistently to invoke sort of two interdependent ideas. One is an ontological claim that human beings do have some kind of intrinsic and equal moral worth to them, right? We're not getting to where it comes from yet, but that mere fact. And secondly, that the existence of that status of dignity entails inescapably also a moral principle of dignity, a normative principle that all human beings are entitled to have that status and equal worth respected by others, and also have a duty to respect it in others. And that normative principle in particular in human rights context applies also to the state and to the power of the state and the power of law and policy. So then, based on that common core meaning of human dignity, there's also a very broad consensus across different bodies of human rights law that certain ways of treating other human beings ought always to be prohibited by law under any circumstances, right? The prohibitions of genocide, slavery, torture, forced disappearance, systematic racial discrimination, for instance. These are all some important examples of the universal recognition of the implications of the status and basic normative principle of human dignity. These are also codified in positive international law as, norms, what we call norms of jus cogens, norms that are they're exceptionless norms, let's put it that way. Similarly, although it goes slightly beyond that, I mean, the most widespread use of dignity across different jurisdictions all through the world in different traditions is found in cases dealing with the protection of life and physical integrity, physical or mental integrity, really, of human persons. In particular, in those kinds of cases where forms of inhuman and degrading treatment are found to violate the dignity of victims. It pervades case law in virtually all the systems. Now, beyond that sort of hard core of dignity, that much, then we can see in sort of the overlapping legal experiences of a variety of different jurisdictions several more areas where this meaning and use of dignity might have less global resonance, but still a fairly broad recognition and acceptance. For example, in a lot of jurisdictions, courts discuss dignity as a value that's central to the definition and protection of individuals' social status and roles. For example, limiting the publication and dissemination of intimate information or photographs. It's a use of dignity that's almost reminiscent of some of the Roman dignitas that we began with and was discussed. In other cases, we see courts using the language and idea of dignity to recognize and respond to sweeping material and social conditions that address the lives of entire communities who live in extreme poverty and vulnerability. Or a third category focuses a lot on equality, deriving from dignity the equality of beings, and therefore recognizing that certain forms of inequality, especially very extreme forms, Clement Sedmak raised this yesterday in the context of Catholic social teaching as well, do inescapably implicate in a negative way and violate human dignity. But nevertheless, that core meaning and what we can regard as maybe this, I use the word with deliberate irony, the penumbras of dignity, quickly shade into greater disagreement as well, right? As soon as we touch those questions like the ones that Carter was just outlining for us in the context of bioethics, questions that touch on fundamentally contested visions of the meaning and destiny of human life, and especially the nature of human freedom. Now, at some level, any jurisdiction that I know of that engages in any complicated wrestling at a legal level with the question of dignity recognizes that there's some kind of important relationship between dignity and human autonomy. For example, human dignity demands that patients be allowed to make free and informed choices about their medical care. Right? And that's widely recognized. So But the right relationship between dignity and autonomy, of course, especially across different traditions, is much more fraught and difficult. And hence we see the use of dignity also, as mentioned a couple times yesterday, in ways not merely that empower people to make free choices, but also that limit their personal choices of their citizens. The dwarf tossing example always gets thrown out, sorry for the pun, as the example. And I think it's just because it's colorful, right? We're talking about dwarf tossing. But in fact, that's not at all an exceptional or even the most interesting of the cases. In a lot of jurisdictions, the language of dignity is used to restrict things like prostitution, the freedom to engage in extreme forms of sadomasochistic conduct, and so forth. Okay, so you see it a lot because those are situations in which the courts find that the commodification or objectification of one's own body is not consistent with inherent human dignity of the person, whether it is a free, in what free means, I don't know in that context, but whether it's a choice or not. And so it's in those areas, these questions of contested notions and understandings of freedom in particular, that we see not just differences across legal systems, but fragmented approaches even within legal systems, even within the same courts, different judges adopting different positions. Sometimes, without any exaggeration, I've seen the same judge adopt contradictory visions of it in the same case, right? So there's no question that we see that, for example, in the public bioethics, the abortion, the euthanasia stuff that Carter was just outlining for us. So in short, in all of these, you look at them together, what do we have? In human rights law, there is an important practical consensus around certain kinds of certain core meanings of and implications of human dignity. There are some lesser but discernible convergences around a cluster of key questions. And then there are some really sharp disagreements and contradictions that reflect not just the variety of moral and intellectual traditions in play, but also the differences in very specific political and social and cultural contexts in which the principle gets instantiated around the world. So the problem then is that arises from this fact that dignity gets used so broadly, is that it elides the areas and the differences between these core areas where we can agree and have reason to agree, good reason to agree, and these intensely disputed areas that are at or beyond the boundaries of our common understandings. And that ambiguity is what allows the use of the normative principle of human dignity to be so vulnerable to charges of inconsistency, incoherence, and ideological manipulation. Because where it in fact represents, tacitly typically, a particular view of human nature and human fulfillment, let's say the difference, again referring to Carter's presentation, between an essentially Christian vision based on Imago Dei and a neo-Kantian emphasis on rationalistic autonomy. These arguments that are based instead on just an unelaborated assertion of dignity as such, without further explanation, simply masks those underlying differences, right? So whether intentionally or only passively, the language of dignity becomes this vehicle for, in those situations, for a surreptitious imposition of one profoundly contested vision of human destiny and human freedom as opposed to another. I'm not saying anything that's particularly new here so far, right? So because of that, we can be tempted to conclude that dignity as a legal concept or principle is either trivial, in the sense that, in cases like torture and slavery, it's so self-evident and undisputed that it doesn't add anything to the discussion. Or, on the other hand, so irreconcilably contested in the other areas, that it's only useful within very circumscribed and homogeneous communities of discourse, if it's useful at all. And therefore, it might be better simply to reject it or set it aside and simply say, it is vacuous. Yeah. But if we take that road, let's not forget what we're giving up, okay? Especially when we think about the core meanings of dignity in a global context. My kids, the older ones of whom are all undergraduates here at Notre Dame, at the moment, have for quite some time always liked to joke about first world problems, right? And we should not forget that a lot of the challenges and problems of dignity in the world are not first world problems. In other words, those things that are regulated by an understanding of dignity that reinforces prohibitions of things like forced labor and torture and systematic forms of exclusion and really grave and gross violations of human rights are the reality of the vast majority of the world today. And those are not places where they're arguing over stem cell research because it's just simply irrelevant to the context. And in those contexts, the ontological claim of dignity helps sustain the very idea of human rights, and the accountability of power and the state and law really does matter. Right? To do without it would be a grave loss. It does represent an ideal that there's a certain unity to the human person where conflicting claims of rights come into play. And it does represent the idea that there are suprapositive values to which any legal system must be held accountable, and that we have the authority, the license, the mandate, really, to demand that positive law of any jurisdiction, any sovereignty, be held accountable to these principles of human dignity. So there are these important achievements, and so the minimal core, even if frustratingly minimal sometimes, is not to be discarded in a world where such violations are so pervasive still. And yet, at the same time, right, we can't ignore the other end of the spectrum where the differences are not only existent, but lead to very problematic consequences and outcomes. And there we are at very much of an impasse in trying to make any kind of serious step forward in constructing and arriving at, to use the conference terms, a persuasive and appealing common understanding of dignity. So how can we do that? How can we arrive at a more widely understood and shared conception that broadens the ways in which law becomes a tool for protecting and realizing dignity without running aground on these shores of incommensurable moral premises? Well, one problem is that law itself, I've become convinced, can't be the grounds on which we do that. It's too limited. The nature of law itself can't accomplish that for us. Legal concepts, as we were just hearing, are artificially constrained in some ways, good ways to serve the purposes of law. But, to use the anthropologist Clifford Geertz's phrase, law tells a story but never the whole story. Deliberately so. Right? Secondly, the nature of law is one that's attendant to facts all the time. And that doesn't make it very easy always to reason from very general principles to very concrete circumstances. Right? Law doesn't proceed as a philosophical discourse that starts from first principles and then deduces its way to coherent conclusions. As Oliver Wendell Holmes put it accurately, even though I won't comment on the purposes of the quote, but the quote itself is still a valuable one. He says, "The life of the law has not been logic, it's been experience," right? And so, we have to, law is always trying to make choices about protecting and recognizing certain very specific claims, or not. And those claims depend a lot on local contingencies, a great deal. I won't say more about that in terms of time, but there's a lot more that could be said about it. The second reason that law and human rights law in particular can't really function as the ground on which we construct these greater understandings and shared meanings is that human rights law is, again, as we heard yesterday briefly from Gil Meilander, deliberately and explicitly constructed on an intentional bracketing and setting aside of its own foundations, right? It's based on a practical agreement. We can agree on what the rights are as long as nobody asks why, Meilander quoted Maritain saying yesterday, right? So there's a fragmentation of the premises and a deliberate attempt to move forward by setting aside that disagreement and deferring it, so to speak. So there is not intentionally a single unified and coherent ethical tradition which grounds human rights as it's practiced in the world today, and there cannot be. Third, as we, again, drawing on some of the things that were said yesterday, dignity points necessarily to a value that is open, that is inexhaustible, because it belongs to the nature of human persons. It can't be contained. And thus, to be respected in law is one thing. To be comprehended by law becomes impossible. It is only in mystery or eschatology, as we heard yesterday, that we can begin to hope for a fuller understanding. So if law is this limited instrument, because it depends on something that comes before it, that precedes it, exists outside of it, prior premises, prior commitments, then, and that the dignity, the value, the status of dignity, you could say, overflows the boundaries of law necessarily. But now, the next point. Jess, how much time, what time do we, since I've started right from Carter, how long do I have?
Till 9:20.
Till 10:20?
9:20. 10:20.
Till 10:20. Great, thanks. Okay. All right, so now let me move on to the third and last part. Sometimes I can't count very well, but I think it's the third. So the fact that our dignity can outstrip our recognition of its implications and its instantiation in our common life and institutions like law, rather than an obstacle, I think may actually point a way forward to us. Because by focusing on our experience of dignity, not merely within the context of practices and institutions that are formally constrained like law, but on the actual human experience of what it means to have and to recognize human dignity. Perhaps it can serve as a starting point for us for a more sustained and critical method of reasoning about which understandings of dignity among these deeply contested approaches corresponds best to our humanity, which is to say, most completely, most universally, most reasonably to the reality of human life in its complexity as we can experience it. Or put in a different way slightly, in trying to articulate an attractive account of human dignity, we need to be able to do more than provide merely a coherent and persuasive philosophical and theological account. We need to focus on a shared concrete experience of humanity, one that opens up the possibility of critical reasoning. I'm not denying the central value and indispensable role of philosophical and theological reflection on it. And this is where the second context that I want to talk about comes into play for us, that of human development. In development practice, for a long time there's been a growing consensus that highlights the central place of human dignity in the work of development. Development theory and practice has been broadly in agreement for several decades now that attention to the aggregate economic growth of communities by itself is simply insufficient to attend to human well-being, and in fact, in some ways, distorts well-being in important aspects. So contemporary approaches to development have for some time been seeking to broaden its effective impact on a wide range of human conditions that relate to human flourishing. I can list all the different ways it does this. I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time, but from at least 1990, the first Human Development Index, to today, to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals last year, there's been this effort to broaden the scope of what human development is oriented towards, precisely in order to be more comprehensive of a fuller range of dimensions of human flourishing, in the recognition that partial, narrow, and fragmented approaches not only are inadequate, but can actually be harmful. So that broadening and that broader attention to human flourishing in the context of development work has increasingly been framed in terms of the idea of dignity. In the synthesis report of the UN Secretary General, for example, last year, of the Sustainable Development Goals, the very title of the report is "The Road to Dignity by 2030." These goals are supposed to be applicable to the global development agenda for the next 15 years. Okay? And so he endorses, it's his name on it, obviously he's not the one who wrote the report, although the woman who did write the report was here speaking at the Kellogg Institute last year. It endorses human dignity as one of the 6 essential elements for delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. So dignity becomes the expression of what development needs to be concerned with and what development is aiming towards. A much more comprehensive understanding of human needs and goods, not just homo economicus. Now, notwithstanding that widespread invocation of the term, I guess it won't surprise you that in the development studies literature, there's virtually no serious scholarship or reasoning about this, let alone any that's rigorous or systematic or grounded in any coherent way. It simply hasn't been discussed in any way. So it's a huge contrast to the intense discussion and debate in recent years in fields like human rights and bioethics that we've heard about. Nevertheless, there are, in fact, in the world of development, a number of actors, many actors actually, for whom dignity is not merely a rhetorical part of their mission statement, not merely a discourse to be repeated, but is in fact in practice at the heart of what their day-to-day experience and work consists in. People and organizations who very consciously, self-consciously try to recognize and honor and understand the meaning of human dignity as central to an explanation of what their work is about and what it means to do the work of development well. And so perhaps, at least loosely, I say this cautiously in a room of philosophers when Alistair McIntyre is probably just a few buildings over here today, if he's in today, we could consider it to be a McIntyrean practice in a certain sense in the way that he's described it in After Virtue. He describes practice as any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. Now, notice how, that's a single sentence, by the way, that's partial sentence. And again, I don't have time to parse it, but even a quick reading of it should make evident that, for example, human rights law as such can't possibly be considered a practice in this sense. It's much too incoherent in terms of the goods that it pursues. Development as such cannot be considered a practice that has within itself the internal good of human dignity. But within development, there are engaged actors who are doing exactly this. And if we look at their practice, seeking in a deliberate way to systematically understand and extend their work of human dignity as a good internal to their work of development, seeking to achieve excellence and so forth, then perhaps we have grounds on which to engage in something new in the world of reflecting on dignity. So I only have 5 minutes left, but so I will be very summary here. That step is the starting point for a recently inaugurated multi-dimensional research project that we've started at the Kellogg Institute. To partner with key development NGOs and local communities and development practitioners, but who share in particular a commitment, an explicit commitment to recognizing and respecting human dignity within the work of development. And on the basis of those examples, to look at instances, to study and try to understand instances where development is attentive to human nature, to the value of the human person, and see how it can give us clarity, greater clarity about it. But it does so in a way that not only starts from human experience, but then brings into our understanding, or our efforts to understand human dignity, more than merely conceptual elaboration in a philosophical and theological sense, but also brings into play the tools of social sciences and of natural sciences, of narrative and witness, qualitative studies about the experience of dignity and development. Then, with that raw material, we can engage in a dialectic reflection with the more theoretical and conceptual understandings that we've already inherited from our tradition and others. There are a variety of insights that different pieces of this research, this cluster of research initiatives, have already begun to reveal in really interesting ways. I'm just going to list them without much elaboration, but you'll see how they already connect in some ways to a lot of the things that we've been saying about dignity over the last day. One is that dignity is certainly a premise of development. Development begins from a recognition of inherent dignity, but also that it's important to recognize that dignity can, in a certain way, as long as we're being careful about how we say it, be an outcome of development. It's not, even if it's figurative in a certain sense, it's not false to say that dignity can be not just violated, but obscured, buried, to the point where it is even understood by the person, the bearer of dignity, as having been destroyed. It may still be inherent, but it can be so obscured that, that it is invisible. And the work of development then works to bring out dignity, not to create it or to confer it, but in some senses to generate its evidence, its visibility, its fruits. A second interesting sort of theme that emerges from this approach is that while dignity necessarily, in some sense, brings into the foreground of our perception the value of individuals, because dignity is inherent in an individual person, nevertheless, focusing on the experiences of dignity and development brings out very clearly, inescapably, that dignity is relational and communal in its realization. That human encounters and relationships are almost always the catalyzing factors for authentic, sustainable, comprehensive forms of human development. Third, that the experience of dignity is inevitably and intimately related to freedom and agency. What freedom means and what freedom is for comes into play. But honoring dignity in development necessarily means recognizing and being willing to take on the risk of another person's freedom. We see this in many of the approaches of the partners that we have to development in things like the way that they incorporate the principle of subsidiarity, or the way that they use the method of accompaniment in carrying out, in fostering sustainable and meaningful development. Fourth, and there are only 5 of these, so I'm really almost done, that dignity at the heart of the practice of development makes evident the way that the universal human condition that we're talking about, the status, which belongs to everybody, is also necessarily always embedded in a specific cultural context, in systems of meaning, especially those that become manifest through forms of religious and cultural practice. And fifth and last, the research shows us how much the subjective conditions of the experience of dignity and the objective ones are inseparable from one another. Now, again, those words merit a lot more explanation and elaboration than I can give it here. But in sort of summary form, you might regard, the objective conditions of dignity being more of what has been the traditional work of development. Conditions of economic income generation, of health conditions, eradication of disease, food and water. But the internal and subjective dimensions of well-being and flourishing are inseparable from those, we find. Things that have to do with the presence and awareness of meaning in one's life, a purpose-oriented life, or the need to account for hope and aspirations in the success of development interventions. So there's a long way to go in this research, so I'm only suggesting that it's an interesting starting point for us in trying to get beyond some of the impasses that we're running up against in articulating a coherent but also persuasive and attractive account for dignity. This methodological emphasis on the value of experience and on practice as the locus for reflection may provide us with a way forward that we really desperately need. Thank you.
So friends, we have time for one question, and then we'll have a 15-minute break, and you can engage our speakers during that time.
Thank you, Paolo. I'd like to ask my questions that start with that Professor Smith presentation earlier about the conflicting views about dignity in the context of an American context. But then my question is, do you think there's any convergence of conflicting views in the concept of dignity in the context of international, so means the human rights law? In the sense, I think that which is true that the issue of stem cell research maybe it's not a big issue in many developing countries, but more and more we see also the issue of abortions and same-sex marriage and stuff like that has become an issue also in many different countries. And the court in different countries, in this context of comparative constitutional law, also began to interpret the issue of abortion and stuff, the concept of dignity. For example, I think that like Inter-American Court of Human Rights, in the case of Costa Rica, and Murillo, they also interpret the case, this concept of dignity, or even that South African Constitutional Court, even long before Obergefell, already legalized same-sex marriage, based also on the issue of concept of dignity. So the question is, is it convergent here, or maybe it's a kind of divergent?
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Great question. So I want to be very cautious and modest about where this is going. I think the real answer is I don't know, okay? But here are a few initial thoughts about it. I think there are important convergences that can come out of this approach. I'll give you two examples, but then the third one, though, is going to be the cautionary note, which can be quite alarming. The two are these. One is the way in which we find it necessary to reflect in a serious way on the relationship of human freedom and agency and autonomy to dignity, I think can serve as a really interesting challenge for us here. In other words, especially in an environment like this one, not in most conferences on dignity that I've participated in, this one's different from most, right? But a place like this, I mean, like in Carter's speech, you know, we are accustomed, and I the first one in line here, all right, when I'm describing this, we're accustomed to simply reacting in an oppositional way to the assertion of the relationship, or the fundamental sort of place of autonomy and agency in discussions of dignity. Why? Because we're in a cultural context in which it gets asserted in such sort of radical and reductive ways that we simply are trying to reject it and offer something else. I think one of the costs of that reality for us has been largely not attending sufficiently to a more positive account of the way that freedom, including individual forms of freedom and autonomy, do express and relate to human dignity in important ways, right? It's not merely the radically rationalistic and reductive accounts that are the only ones there. We need another one. And if we do, then there may be these kinds of convergences, right? I think a second form in which you can see some convergences in them has to do precisely over questions of relationship and relationality. We have in the evidence of development and dignity such powerful evidence, including measurable, tangible, empirical evidence of it, that it is a great support to a number of examples in our sort of North Atlantic context of where dignity and the role of relationships comes into play. I'm thinking, for example, about a lot of the best recent work on education and what actually works in an educational context, right? But here's the cautionary note, and that is that a lot of the world of development and the world of human rights is in fact dominated by very, very strong interests of economic and political and ideological power. And we have to be realistic about that, right? So when the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, declares that dignity requires that you have to be able to use artificial methods of conception, which is what you were referring to, or when development aid in Africa is explicitly conditioned on, liberalizing abortion laws, that's not a form of convergence. That's a form of neo-colonialist imperialism. Now, it's my hope that a project that focuses on the experience of dignity in the context of development can help to bring out exactly for the world, the developing world, those contradictions, to show why what is often being foisted on them in the name of development is in fact a false promise.